Okay, Kat, so I chose the Mod 9 journal entry on bioarchaeology ethics. So the first question asks, do you think it's ethical for archaeologists to study human remains? Explain your reasoning using supporting evidence from the class materials provided. So, yes, I do think there are situations where it is ethical to study human remains. And in the interview with Stacy Drake, she was talking about how a lot of Europeans, like modern Europeans today, don't really have ethical dilemmas with studying remains from Europe because it's very normalized. And so, yeah, I think when it's just like a bunch of stuff that doesn't have like super religious or indigenous kind of ethical questions to it, I do think that it's fine, especially if like I'm a very Eurocentric looking American, so I think ethically, if I were digging up the remains of other Eurocentric Americans, I think it would make sense that it would be okay ethically if I did it. But when you're dealing with stuff like anything basically with like indigenous people, there's definitely like ethical dilemmas with that. And it's all about being incredibly communicative to a group of people that has already like been treated so poorly throughout history and even recent history. So that's like ultimately, yes, I think it's mostly okay, especially if you are along the lines of those people you are studying. But when there's very religious, cultural, or indigenous reasons behind it, it's very important to openly communicate what's going on with the people of basically the ancestors of those people. So the next question is, what do you think are the biggest ethical concerns slash dilemmas bioarchaeologists should be aware of when they conduct their research? And it was just like I was talking about. If you are not the ancestors, quote unquote, of those people that you were digging up, then it's really important to talk to the current day ancestors of those people and ask them what would be the most appropriate way to handle these remains. There's a lot of historical context of white people just kind of going around and taking whatever they want and doing whatever they want with it. And I bet that leaves a bad taste in a lot of other ethnic groups around the world that are, you know, they don't want white people to continue that trend, basically. And so I can see the ethical dilemma with that. And what we should be aware of in our research is just, once again, communicating and just understanding what is disrespectful to a body as defined by their ancestors versus not. The next question is, in what circumstance might it be more ethical to recover and study human remains than to leave them untouched or unstudied? Can you think of an example to illustrate your point? There is a really dark chapter in US history, and that would be the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre, where tons of Black Americans, I think when there is a whole entire massacre of people that has been trying to be covered up by not only states and local government officials, but federal government as well, there is kind of an ethical question where archaeologists could go in there and be like, no, they died of these reasons. This is how many people died. This is how serious it was. This is something that should not be covered up. And as unfortunate as it would be to open up those wounds, there's almost like a sense of not closure, I want to say, but more understanding behind what happened and making sure that the truth comes out, which is another thing Stacey Drake was talking about in her interview. She's very much all about, like, she's speaking for people who can no longer speak. So she's trying to get as much information put down correctly. And I think it could bring a lot of justice to understanding just how awful something like the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre was. So history can no longer water down the significance of what's going on. I believe, yes, okay, so very recently in Canada, the remains of 215 children, even as young as the age of 3, were discovered at a formal residential school site. And it's hard to talk about, but there is a bioarchaeological significance to help understand just how awful this was, and showing how many children were buried, how many died, what ages they died, stuff like that. It's very important to understand, because once again, this way the Canadian government cannot sweep this under the rug. There's evidence to suggest that this was very intentional. It was very well hidden by local government and everything. And it just goes, because 215 children, that's not just something that can easily be covered up. There had to be some government participation, and it's just about accountability when it comes to like mass murders and everything. And as more as like just a general context, if it's not about people being murdered, they just slowly died and went into the ground. I'm sorry, I'm like going off here and I don't even remember the question. Oh, when is it ethical to recover bodies? Yes, I think in the case of murder or foul play, that is when it is ethical to recover bodies, as stated in my examples. What do you think is the most significant quote from the reading or podcast? Why/how is this quote pushing your understanding of anthropology further? And one thing that was talked about in both of them, actually, in the podcast interview, we talked about NAGPRA that was apparently enacted in 1999, which is way too recent. That would be the quote, basically. It's just when they were discussing this, because one, any of my anthropological focus in my minor is anything to do with Indigenous people. And I have taken several classes and they have never once mentioned NAGRA. So that was really cool to learn about. And well, it's like a nice step. The guy in the podcast did say that there's still a lot of problems with NAGRA, and that it's not as white savior clean as it comes off. What concept, statement, or detail from the reading or podcast did you find the most interesting, and why? Once again, that would be NAGRA. It was just cool to see that there is United States of America official policy that is protecting Native American grave sites. What questions do you have about the article and podcast or other module material? Is there something you want to learn more about? Is something just not sitting right? Let me know what you're struggling with. And no, everything was great. I like archaeology, so all of this was like some of my favorite stuff that I got to learn about. And I don't really have any questions about it, or I'm not really struggling with any of it, because when I like stuff, my brain is willing to accept the information a lot more than if I feel like I'm being forced to learn something. And then the final question: can you connect the topic of this module to outside material or your own background knowledge on the podcast or article's main themes? Does the material remind you of something from your past, a TV program you once watched, or a conversation you had in another class? Tell me about it. And that just goes back to like when I learned about the Tulsa, Oklahoma City massacre on my own, and just all the awful stuff I learned about it, which was ironically from a Bailey Sarian video, who she does her makeup while she tells you about like murder and everything. And so that's when I found out a lot about that. And obviously that wasn't taught to us in school, because why would it be? It's something that happened to an ethnic group, and for some reason we have a very whitewashed history that's taught to us. And then recently with the Indigenous children that were found in Canada, which I don't want to discuss anymore. But yeah, those would be other outside influences about that kind of pertain to what we just learned about and bodies and everything. And then I do remember learning about the Iceman a while back. So yeah, that's it, Kat. Thank you so much. I will get this edited down and turned it in.